Chapter 7. The Parker Brothers. Obadiah Parker was not a man to be trifled with. A machinist by trade, Obadiah was exacting in business, imposing in stature, and dictatorial in nature. He ran a very tight ship, a conspicuous absence of nautical experience notwithstanding. He demanded no less of his wife Harriet, née Rice, and his children, including elder son Bernard and his youngest Herbert. Devout Adventists, the Parkers brooked no frivolity and tolerated no fools. The family was admired by their neighbors in Bear River, if not particularly liked. Bernard Parker, just shy of his 35th birthday as the Kempton drama unfolded, was as unerring and precise as his father and soon found gainful employment as a government surveyor. Having gone in search of a stable, obedient spouse, Bernard settled on Christine Milner, who bore the necessary requirements in abundance, and the couple had 2 children, son Chauncey and daughter Millie. Bernard Parker, who was only slightly less autocratic than his father, did little to counter the family's reputation for earnestness and a decided lack of humor. With Herbert, the apple fell a little farther from the tree. All of 18 and bristling with the first flush of manhood, young Herbert was in the employ of the lumbermen who harvested the teeming woodlands of the Annapolis Valley. Herbert possessed a certain witless charm but was far coarser in tongue and spirit than his elders. By unanimous consent, he still had some growing up to do. The Parker brothers were lifelong denizens of Bear River, well acquainted with the Kemptons and with Peter Wheeler. Herbert had occasionally worked alongside Wheeler in the lumber mills. Prior to January 28, 1896, Herbert and Peter had been friendly, if not exactly friends. They shared a love of bawdy jokes and earthy conversation, longtime staples in Wheeler's hard-scrabble life but still novelties for nihilists like Herbert Parker. Brother Bernard knew Wheeler only by reputation and by sight, having encountered him in passing over the years. If either Parker bore Wheeler a grudge, it was well hidden from those around them. Through a convoluted series of circumstances, the Parkers found themselves in the hot seat alongside Wheeler, although unlike the accused, the brothers had voluntarily taken their seats. The strange chain of events that bound their fates together began when Annie's body was discovered. As Lovett asked for any and all witnesses to come forward just 6 hours later, the Parker boys were among the throng who stepped up. Bernard, the elder, went first. Earlier that day, while others stood huddled and horrified around the tangled remains of the murdered girl, Bernard Parker sprang into action, accompanied by a few of the younger local men. Parker as amateur sleuth and his self-deputized posse searched the grounds surrounding the Kempton home. According to Bernard's testimony, he quickly discovered a set of tracks in the snow near the family's barn. Ever the surveyor, Bernard unrolled a map he had drawn to illustrate his findings. On the schematic Parker had made a series of dashed lines in red to indicate the footprints. It was compelling evidence. Although the tracks did not identify the assailant, they gave some hint as to how the killer made his way to the house. Lovett admitted the map into evidence, thanked Bernard for his efforts, and that seemed to be the end of it. Other witnesses came and went as the coroner continued his inquiry. By the end of the first day, Wheeler's so-called lie had been exposed and the inquest had taken on a far more malodorous stench. Before Lovett called the second day's session to order, Bernard Parker approached the coroner for a quiet word. Bernard told the young doctor that, in light of Wheeler's obvious involvement in the crime, he had returned to the hillside near the Kempton home and discovered some additional evidence. Parker asked Lovett to recall him to the stand so that he might reveal his new findings. As the morning session began, Bernard Parker once again raised his hand to God. He unfurled a new hastily rendered map and told the enthralled audience he had discovered yet another set of tracks, also shown in red. In addition to the footprints near the barn, the newly found tracks ran from the back door of the house to the street, veered across a field and continued toward the road where Wheeler lived. Parker was resolute. There was only one set of tracks in the snow and they led straight from the crime scene to Wheeler's front door. To further bolster his case against Wheeler, Parker took the time to make a few additions to his latest map. Parker drew in key features not evident on his first map, including the locations where children in the village claimed to have seen Peter in the hours before Annie died. Viewed today, the differences between the two maps are subtle, disturbing, and unquestionably damning, both for Wheeler and for Parker. The first map was a simplified schematic of some suspicious footprints. The second map was a blueprint for murder in which all roads led to Peter Wheeler. The latest revisions to Parker's map and his testimony left little doubt as to the surveyor's intentions. Bernard Parker was no longer bearing witness in generalities. He was now spearheading the effort to convict Peter Wheeler on the spot. Still acting as a self-appointed lawman, Parker had, over the course of the prior evening, examined the suspect footprints in far greater detail. He claimed each impression measured exactly 10 inches in length, a tad on the small side for a man's shod foot. Parker was certain the tracks were made by someone sporting larrigans, a traditional knee-high oiled-skin moccasin, typically fringed and laced up the front. Larrigans were readily available from the merchants in town, favored by working men. A pair could be had for $1.75. Using the length as a guide, Parker had deduced the size of the larrigans responsible for the prints. The boots were, he announced confidently, a size 6. Parker's detective work drew admiring murmurs from the crowd. The Whispers, the new coin of the realm, decreed that the footprints proved Peter Wheeler was the killer, even though no one had yet ascertained the size of Wheeler's feet. As rampant speculation ricocheted about the hall, Lovett took Parker's second map into evidence and thanked him for his testimony. The Parkers were not yet finished with Peter Wheeler. Later that same day, young Herbert Parker supplanted his brother in the witness chair, but with an entirely different tale to tell. Herbert had no maps on offer, but what he wielded was far more incriminating. He told the people of Bear River that on several occasions, he had heard Peter Wheeler speak of Annie with immoral threatenings. As the predicted gasps subsided, Lovett pressed Herbert to elaborate. Herbert, showing uncharacteristic restraint, recounted how Peter often boasted that he would have his way with Annie, whether she obliged or not. Herbert then stepped down, having planted the knife squarely in Wheeler's back. As this was an inquest and not a court of law, little could be done to repair the damage wrought by Herbert Parker. Parker's testimony was hearsay, and during a trial, would have been deemed inadmissible, as any opposition was a simple case of he said. In a coroner's inquest, however, the rules of evidence are loosened. If it came down to a question of credibility, Herbert Parker was not under suspicion and his word automatically carried more weight. The constraints of a coroner's hearing may be relaxed, but such flexibility did not favor Peter Wheeler. He was still prohibited from speaking in his own defense and had no counsel representing him to object to the hearsay. As such, Parker's accusation went unchallenged. Like an Atlantic-born blizzard, the Parkers had swept in and buried Peter Wheeler. They were, after all, only preaching to a dangerously hostile choir. The crowded academy was already predisposed to think the worst of Wheeler and eagerly accepted the brothers' jaundiced testimony as fact. So, too, did the coroner's jurymen. Between the brothers, Bernard's testimony may have seemed far more reasoned and objective, at least at first glance, but it was in reality hopelessly flawed. Much of Parker's evidence would have been called into question had opposing counsel been permitted, but Wheeler sat defenseless and undefended as Bernard's unsubstantiated theories were admitted as facts. The first fly in Parker's ointment was the footprint medium itself, that most malleable and unpredictable bane of Canadian winters, snow. Of all the scientific advances of the late 19th century, arguably the most utilitarian was the emergence of relatively precise meteorology. Victorian houses, hotels, and marinas filled their vestibules with a dazzling array of barometers, thermometers, gauges, and all things atmospheric. Almost overnight, the weather had gone from a banal topic of conversation to a full-fledged science, complete with its own governmental agency generating mountains of data. According to that agency, Environment Canada and its National Climate Data Archives, the week surrounding Annie's death was a rough one for Bear River. On Saturday, January 25, 5 3/4 inches of snow fell on the town, lending some small credence to their stake as the Switzerland of Nova Scotia. This deluge was followed by 3/4 of an inch on Sunday the 26th, a light dusting on the 27th, another inch on the 28th, the day Bernard and his gang searched for prints, and just shy of another inch on Wednesday the 29th, the occasion of Parker's second search. As if the serial snowfall were not enough, temperatures fluctuated wildly throughout the week, with daytime highs well above freezing and nighttime lows in the single digits. Accordingly, the accumulating snow melted and settled and each new fall obliterated all prior prints. Any impressions made in the ever-shifting blanket of white were significantly modified in the process. This meteorological roller coaster left any and all tracks indistinct, unstable, and therefore unreliable. Indeed, the notion that accurate measurements were possible under such conditions was as suspect as Parker's motives. Bernard's second problem was his stubborn stance regarding the number of prints. According to his statement, there was a lone set of tracks leading from the house to the barn. It was a straightforward declaration that sounded convincing. The problem was that the heaviest snowfall, in which the prints were made, came on Saturday when both Isaac Kempton and his son Ernest were still in the house with Annie. Isaac would later testify that the two men did not leave the home until 8:30 a.m. on Monday the 27th. The weekend of the blizzard, Isaac, Ernest, or Annie each made several daily trips to the barn to milk and tend to the family cow, Yet Parker claimed to see no evidence of such traffic recorded in the snow, just a lone set of prints that he argued could only have been made by the killer on Monday night. Problem number 3, Bernard Parker's unflinching identification of the make and size of the footwear responsible for the prints. Such an unprecedented act of sleuthing bordered on the incredible, elevating Parker to the rarefied air normally reserved for Holmes and Poirot. How Parker reached his astonishing conclusions was not stipulated, hardly surprising, given there was no defense counsel present to obligate him to reveal his methodology. In the end, Bernard Parker's testimony was a classic case of smoke and mirrors, a triumph of flash over substance. Parker spoke with his characteristic certainty, a model of gravitas and somber reflection. His manner was one of staunch conviction, and barring any defense queries to invoke doubt, the audience and jurors embraced his testimony without question. That it was, at best, the grasping of a novice detective escaped the uncritical eyes of those assembled. What also evaded detection was the nuanced yet unmistakable way Bernard changed his testimony between his first and second appearance, revisions clearly recorded on the maps Parker admitted into evidence. The first map shows a set of footprints. The second might as well have been a photograph of Wheeler committing the act. Why Bernard Parker took it upon himself to play both detective and prosecutor in the case evaded the historic record. In all likelihood, his initial search of the area and his documentation of the footprints were altruistic. A beloved member of his community had been murdered, and he, along with his fellow residents, wanted to do all they could to help. But something clearly shifted in Bernard Parker on the night of January 28, 1896, and, as suspicion fell on Peter Wheeler, so, too, did the heavy hand of Bernard Parker. The Parker brothers would go on to repeat their accusations and testimony for a second time in a makeshift courtroom of Bear River and twice more in a courthouse in Kentville as Wheeler sat on trial for his life. Herbert's testimony never wavered. Bernard's continued to morph in artful but telling ways. At every juncture, the media was there to contort Parker's words even further to fit their prescribed apologue. If ever a man needed a lawyer, it was Wheeler, and it was now. That there was none to be had proved, quite literally, to be the death of him.